Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin. Please welcome ExcelinEd Board Member, Dee Bagwell-Haslam.
Good morning. I have been blessed to work with many visionary leaders in a wonderfully diverse set of fields. And luckily, I've found that some of the most powerful minds and personalities are drawn to the world of education reform. And that makes sense. What a better legacy to leave than the world where each generation can dare to hope more than those who have preceded them. But we have an obstacle. One of the recurring phrases we hear so much is about preparing for the 21st century. We are fortunate today to hear from one of the world's greatest minds. Andreas Schleicher is not just a thinker, he's a doer, an inspiration for everyone who dreams boldly. Many of you know Andreas from his previous appearance at the National Summit on Education Reform. And you certainly know his role as a developer of the International PISA assessment, which has done more than any other tool to draw our attention to education achievement gaps between countries. Currently, the United States ranks 31st. Clearly, we still have lots of work to do to prepare our children for success in today's global economy. Professor Schleicher is also a prolific author. His latest book is World Class: How to Build a 21st Century School System. It's a wonderful guide for improving education systems around the world. Please join me in welcoming Andreas Schleicher.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be at Reform again. And as you know, at the OECD, one of the things that we do always is to track the learning outcomes of students all around the world. And actually, we started to do that in 2016 in the field of science. And 2006 is a long time ago for all of us. But to give you sort of a hint, it was the year before the iPhone was invented. Twitter was still a sound, the Amazon still a river, and many of the things that we took for granted actually didn't exist. And it was also a time where you could see, when you look at education, some progress in the United States in advancing on the PISA assessment. But the world didn't stop in 2009. Remember, maps became dynamic, cars became electric, sometimes starting to drive without a driver, lots of things, but we haven't seen that translate into progress in student learning outcomes in science. And if you think just what happened in the last few years, think about robotics, cloud computing, biogenetics, big data, huge developments in the field of science and technology, but actually learning outcomes have remained pretty flat. And of course, the United States is absolutely not alone. In fact, you can see similar trends in many parts of the industrialized world. But some countries show us that we can do better. If you look to Portugal, for example, a relatively poor country in the south of Europe, they have kept moving forward, even in the most difficult circumstances. You can look to Singapore, moving from good to great. And some parts of China you can no longer put on a map. Dramatically transformed their education systems and getting students to achieve better learning outcomes. And of course, some states in the United States, I put Massachusetts here on the map, also show us that actually strong performance in a field like science is really possible. Now, how do we change this? The first thing we always think to is money. And Unfortunately, money only works up to a point. If you're a very poor country, on the left side, you can see those in yellow. Basically, there, money is a good predictor for better outcomes. But the United States is actually well beyond the point at which you see any relationship between volume, spending on learning, and the quality of learning outcomes. You might think about time, learning time. Now, how many hours of instruction do you give students? And there's huge variability of this across countries. In blue, you can see the hours that students spend in school. In yellow, the hours they spend learning out of school, private tutoring, homework, things like that. You look at the United Arab Emirates spending close to 60 hours per week in student learning. But you can contrast this with Finland on the left side, where you can see students spend a little more than half than that time. Huge differences in the volume of learning time. But when you look at productivity, learning gains per hour of instruction, you can see that in countries like Finland or Germany or Switzerland or Japan or Estonia. Students learn a lot in very little time. Whereas in the United Arab Emirates, they spend a lot of time and learn very little. So again, it's not the volume of time. It's the quality of time that students spend. And if you look at the United States, it's also more to the lower end. It's a productivity challenge, not a challenge of adding more time or just more resources. And that, of course, makes educational change very, very hard. The status quo in education has many protectors. You can see that around the world. And sometimes we as parents are part of the problem. We get very anxious when our children learn things that we did not learn when we were young, or we get even more anxious when children no longer learn things that we felt were so terribly important. Teachers are more likely to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach. And you can lose an election over education, but you rarely win one over education because it just takes so much more time to translate good ideas into better outcomes. And unfortunately, the road of educational reform is littered with many good ideas that were poorly implemented. There's a lot of provider capture in education. This is really, really hard to change. But in the 21st century, we need to make those kinds of changes. And the first thing we need to think about, how do you actually move from just having some people succeed in education to getting everybody learning at very high levels. And I'm going to show you in a moment that is actually an attainable goal. It's also moving from teaching students something to giving them a reliable compass and the navigation tools to find their own way in this increasingly volatile, complex world. Complex ways of thinking, complex ways of doing. That's really important, and that requires a very different caliber of teaching. In the past, you could have actually teachers just focus on the delivery of prefabricated instruction. Today, you need to expect a high-quality sort of profession of knowledge workers. And that's, again, something we can see emerging. And that, of course, requires a different work organization. In the past, our work organizations in education were kind of very hierarchical, very industrial, very heavy. In the modern world, teachers have a much more flexible career path. Schools have much more discretion on how they work with teachers, how they frame teacher careers, and so on. These are the kind of transitions and changes that we've seen in some parts of the world, and that really are important for the world of tomorrow. Let's go through some of this in more detail. Now, how do we move from having only some students succeed to getting all people do at high levels now? Some people say that's impossible. Now, poverty is destiny. That's a kind of very sort of popular way of thinking. And in fact, when you look at this, here I order learning outcomes in mathematics by decile of social background. You can see there's a huge social gap in the United States. The 10% children from the poorest backgrounds do very poorly on the PISA tests. The children from wealthy backgrounds do a lot better. But is that inevitable? Well, if you look at the same children in Singapore, children with exactly the same kind of social background from those disadvantaged families, they do as well as the average American student. And if you look at the same children in the province of Shanghai in China, the 10% most disadvantaged children in China, who often come from family backgrounds with no education history, they come close to what we see among the top performers in the industrialized world. So poverty need not be destiny. That's one of the biggest messages from international comparisons. All children can learn and all children can achieve at very high levels. Part of this has to do with how do we allocate resources with needs. And what you can see is, for example, classes for disadvantaged schools tend to be larger than classes for wealthy schools. That might be what you expect, because it's been like this for many years. But when you look actually around the world, in the industrialized world, it's now the other way around. Most countries would allocate more resources, more teachers to the children who need them most. Classes would be smaller for the most disadvantaged than they are for the wealthy children, because if you come from a disadvantaged background, that's where school really makes such a fundamental difference. Now you think, that's great, getting more teachers in the disadvantaged schools is part of the answer, but actually it looks better than it actually is. Even in the industrialized world, you can see when it comes to the quality of teachers, the shortage of quality teachers in most countries is still much greater in disadvantaged schools than in wealthy schools. We may have succeeded to put more teachers, more resources into disadvantaged schools, but most countries really struggle to attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms and to get the best leaders to the toughest schools. There's something we can learn from countries like Japan or Estonia that have been very, very good in modeling teacher careers through disadvantage. China as well. If you are a teacher in a high-performing school and you want to advance in your career, the only way to do that fast is actually to take on one of the toughest classrooms or to go to one of the toughest schools. So linking careers with challenges, one of the ways in which some countries have broken the cycle, but as you can see, on average, we're not doing very well in the industrialized world nor in the United States. And the real challenge is that what our data show is that children from disadvantage often get a different type of mathematics instruction than children from privileged backgrounds. They're much less exposed to deep conceptual understanding in mathematics than children from wealthier families are. So it's not just about numbers. It's the type of education that we give to children from different backgrounds that really varies. It's something really to work on. Let me come to the second topic. How do we move from having students reproduce what we know to actually having them think beyond that, extrapolate from what they know, apply, use their knowledge in novel situations? Now, that's what tomorrow's society is really about. Actually, when you look at the evolution of labor demand, you can see that very clearly. The kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, are precisely the kind of things that have become easy to digitize, to automate, to outsource. The modern world no longer rewards us just for what we know, but for what we can do with what we know. Very, very important. The type of skills that make people successful, type of knowledge, has really advanced. In the past, we used to learn to do the work, and now learning has become the work. Students who can think creatively, solve complex problems, those students have a huge advantage. Those who have really good foundations in a discipline. When you think about how we are doing on this, one of the things that we did more recently is actually test the skills of the entire adult populations across countries, not just students in school. And when you look at older generations, now here are the scores of 55 to 65-year-olds on managing complex digital information, being prepared for the flat world, you can say it's only about 1 in 10 older people who have the skills they need in today's economy and society. But the United States is much better positioned. It's at least 1 in 5. And now you tell me, well, that's all a problem of older people not keeping up with technology. Among young people, it's going to look a lot better. But actually, it's true. The bars get longer in the 16 to 24-year-old cohort. But they're not very long. Now, you still talk only about every second person moving into the workforce, being equipped for the digital world that we have today. And when you look over time, the United States used to be at the top. Now it's getting closer to the bottom. Not because things got worse, absolutely not. The blue bars are longer than the green. But some countries have moved so much faster. Singapore was at the low end when you think about 2 generations ago, and now they're at the top, not because they've been able to actually drive progress very much more faster. When you think about, before the great industrial revolution, neither education nor technology made a big difference for the lives of most people. But then came the Industrial Revolution, moving technology ahead of the skills of people. And while today, we marvel at the outcomes of the Industrial Revolution, you wouldn't have wanted to live in those times. People had a very hard time because they were not prepared for the norms of the industrial society. But it was the time when we invented universal public schooling, moving people ahead of technology, and creating generations of prosperity. But if we're honest with ourselves, actually, we have not seen much change in the model of schooling since those days. And today we face the digital revolution, moving technology once again ahead of the capacities of people and creating the kind of social pain that young people leave college having a hard time finding a good job, and at the same time employers say they cannot find the people with the skills they need. So how do we actually move education once again ahead of the technologies of our time? How do we pair the artificial intelligence of computers with the human qualities that actually going to enable us to harness the power of technology? That's really the challenge of our times. When you talk to teachers, and at the OECD, we survey them regularly, you see that actually teachers have often a quite modern view on teaching. 95% of American teachers say, my role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own inquiry. Or you have 82% who say, students learn best by finding solutions on their own. Or 85% say thinking and reasoning is more important than curriculum content. Looks like a very constructivist mindset among teachers. But do teachers really do what they say? When you look actually at the outcomes in the classroom, when you survey students, you get a very different picture. If American teachers would do what they say, have this very constructivist, individualized approach to teaching and learning, they would score at the bottom when it comes to using rote learning, memorization, drill, practice, repetition. But the bottom place is already given to Switzerland, then comes Poland, then comes Germany. Those are the countries where rote learning is not very familiar, very common in classrooms. In fact, the United States comes up pretty high on that. There is actually a big gap between the aspiration of teachers and what actually happens in classrooms. Had I asked you at the beginning, which is the country which does most drill and, rote learning, you might have tipped on China, but actually China is now at a lower rank than the United States. There's a lot more emphasis in China on deep learning, on intrinsic motivation, on critical thinking, on non-routine problem solving. Kids have become really, really good at that. We have often not realized, we still attribute a world to that part of that basically no longer exists. And in the United States, that's still a struggle. So the one thing, teachers' reports on the world have advanced, but actually the reality in classrooms hasn't changed as much as it would need to be. Is this a problem? Well, memorization can help you solve some tasks, but it actually can also hinders you on other tasks. And when you actually look at the type of tasks that we propose in international assessments, you can see the more complex mathematical tasks are getting, the less is memorization a useful tool to solve those problems. That is one of the reasons why American 15-year-olds are not reaching the highest level on these international assessments, where you need to be able to think like a mathematician as opposed to just remembering formulas and equations. You have to think like a scientist, where you have to use advanced mathematical reasoning. And again, where the Chinese are very strong on those kinds of elaboration strategies, connecting the familiar with the unfamiliar, basically thinking across the boundaries of subject disciplines, that is actually the most powerful predictor at the most complex problems. Why is this important these days? Because the world is moving from the left to the right. The kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, routine cognitive skills, that's where computers have become very, very powerful. It's on the right side, solving unstructured, complex problems where human capacities are really, really important. What we have learned from high-performing education systems is, first of all, they have a high level of cognitive demand on students. Every student is expected to do really, really well. The standards that high-performing systems set for their students are often way higher than what we see in the United States. No? Students here often get good marks, even if their results are just so you wouldn't find it. Focus, teaching fewer things at greater depth. That's one of the things that we see in high-performing countries. If you look into an American classroom in mathematics on average, you see students solving 17, 18 problems in a lesson, no? Doing lots of things. No? If you go to a Japanese classroom, you would see students working on one problem. No? And it's all about finding adequate solution strategies, negotiating them, contrasting them, critiquing them, teaching fewer things at greater depths. And last but not least, coherence. No? Modeling meaningful learning progressions, no? Understanding how students learn. It's about remaining true to the disciplines, but at the same time fostering cross-disciplinary learning, no? Helping students to think across the boundaries of subject matter disciplines. No? It's about focusing on things that will allow students to extrapolate what they know to novel contexts, no? To new ideas. It's about learning that is thematic, problem-based, project-based. And remember that some things are caught, not taught, particularly when we talk about character qualities that are becoming increasingly important in the world in which we live. If you actually look at the last PISA test, students in Japan did very, very well on collaborative problem-solving skills. They were actually very good social problem solvers, team workers. Why? Because everything in Japanese schools is structured around collaboration and responsibility. At the end of a lesson, at the end of a school day, students will clean the classroom with a teacher, and that's not because they can't afford a room cleaner, it's because we are all in this together. We take collective responsibility for our learning environments. And you can see that in the PISA results, but those things are not taught, instructed, they're actually caught in the immersive learning environments. The past was divided, content, division. Schools are very, very good in keeping students inside and the rest of the world outside. What we see in our high-performing system is actually a high level of integration. Schools are very open environments, well connected with their communities. Teachers work across disciplines well together on this. The past was about prescription, telling teachers what to teach and how to teach. The future is really about high level of professional ownership. We've looked at this in the OECD in more detail, and it's really about making teaching not just financially attractive. Now, you can pay teachers well, but that's not actually making teaching more prestigious. It's about offering more diverse, more interesting teacher careers, giving schools a lot more flexible how to work with the teachers now. When you actually look at this in the light of our data, it has to do with knowledge. The first thing that students can figure out about their teachers is whether they have a real passion for their subject and are really, really good at that. Deep content knowledge on the part of teachers. But it's not just knowledge about the discipline, it's also knowledge about how students learn in that discipline, and knowledge about the students themselves, about the lives of their students. That's one of the things that we can see in countries like Singapore or even China, that teachers are very, very deeply connected with their students. They spend a lot of time with individual students and with their families. They teach a lot less than American teachers, but they work a lot more than American teachers. And that means they spend more time with other teachers, with students, and so on. They have a very deep knowledge of their students. And that's something that also allows them to create a very strong disciplinary climate where students work well together. Well, knowledge. The other part is professional autonomy. Teachers being creative designers of innovative learning environments. And professional autonomy is not about I teach or I do what I like. It's about I do what I know is right in the name of my profession. You have a really deep understanding of professional knowledge in some of the highest performing education systems. And there's something more, and that's a collaborative culture. Teaching can be a very isolating profession, where teachers work behind 4 closed walls and actually only talk to their students. What we see in the highest performing education systems is a lot of engagements of teachers with each other. You can see that in Northern Europe, in Netherlands, in Finland, in Estonia. You can see that in Canada, in the province of Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia. Very strong collaborative culture. And most notably, you can see that in China. Teachers would use a digital platform where they upload or can upload their ideas, their projects, their lesson plans. And the more other teachers will download your lessons, criticize your lessons, improve your lessons, use your lessons, the more popular you become in the system. And at the end of the school year, your teachers or your principal will ask you not only how well did you teach your students in your class, but what contribution did you make to the profession? Professional collaboration is the cornerstone, really, of systems. And that's something that you see also a lot in the United States. On our data, actually, the United States ranks quite well on this. But look at this in a little bit more detail. What you can see is that, on the one hand, American teachers are very collaborative. But often this is just about sharing information, talking to colleagues. It's a very kind of superficial level of collaboration. When you actually go to the deeper layers of collaboration that are really important, they become very rare. Team teaching, collaborative professional development, but most importantly, classroom observation. I showed you before this big gap between what teachers say they are doing and what's actually happening in the classroom. I have asked myself many times, where does this gap come from? And one answer that I found is, it's an hypothesis only, that teachers actually do not know what they're actually doing because they don't have that mirror that teachers in many other countries have, where they would be open to other teachers, where teaching would be more of a public activity, where other teachers would be engaged, where lesson planning, lesson design, lesson analysis would be a very common part of education. Why do I say this? Because our data actually show that the more teachers teach jointly as a team, the more they observe other classes, the more they're engaged in joint activities across subjects, so the math teacher working with the history teacher and so on. The more they take part in collaborative learning, the greater their level of self-efficacy. Sense of ownership over professional practice really depends on the kind of collaborative professional culture in a school. And that has something to do with the work organization. I want to show you something here that is quite intriguing. On the vertical axis, you have the student-staff ratio. How many teachers are you allocating to every 100 students? The lower you are, the more generous you are in teacher supply. And on the horizontal axis, you see basically the size of a class. And what's so interesting is that two things don't go together. You can take a country like the United States, quite generous in terms of teacher supply, and classes are very small. You contrast this with China, where student-staff ratios are exactly like they are in the United States, but class sizes are very large. And now you think, well, the United States is doing better than China because small classes are valued by parents and principals and teachers and so on. But actually, there comes a price for this. An American teacher, as I said, have much less time to do other things than teaching. They go from one lesson to the next. Whereas a Chinese teacher, because they have a large class that gives them so much more time, they teach less than half of an American teacher, gives them so much more time to work with individual students, to provide tutoring, lessons, work with their colleagues, advance their own careers or the careers of their colleagues. Similar resources deployed very differently. You can see really that across countries. And now you can say, well, maybe small classes are not so much an issue of effectiveness, but they are still something that will be important for teachers' job satisfaction. Actually, we surveyed that, and in our data, we could not find any relationship between the size of a class and the job satisfaction of teachers. It's absolutely flat. So it's not the size of the class. What makes teachers happy and unhappy is all about professionalization. The satisfaction with the profession, the satisfaction with the work environment, all depends on the three things that I highlighted before. Professional knowledge, professional autonomy, collaborative culture. That is our best predictor for the job satisfaction of teachers. It's also our best predictor for teachers' sense of self-efficacy and for their belief how well teaching is valued in society. A very, very important part of the equation. Success is also about moving away from the kind of very heavy industrial school systems that we still have to school systems that are much more outward-looking, much more open, much more flexible. Have a look at some of the data on this. What our data actually show is that where schools own many parts of the decision, you can see this here on the left, on how they use resources, on curriculum, on disciplinary policies, on assessment, that's actually one of the predictors for better learning outcomes. This holds also for teachers. Ownership of practice at the school. Very, very important predictor, and it's not so much, an issue about local or school districts. There we can actually see very little. The ownership that lies at a school district, at least across countries, doesn't explain much variation in learning outcomes. It's really the responsibility at the front line that is the best predictor for better learning outcomes by the school, by the teacher, at least according to the PISA data. So, how is it looking across countries? You can see there are huge differences across countries. If you go to the Netherlands, virtually every decision is made by the school. Who do I hire as a teacher? How do they progress in their careers? How do we teach what we teach? How do we design the kind of instructional environment? All of those decisions are made by schools. And one way you could say every school in the Netherlands is like a voucher or charter school in the United States. It's one of the highest performing education systems where actually everything is done at the front line with great success, a very diverse learning environment. It's the Czech Republic. England. England used to be like the United States, where here, like you can see for the United States, very few decisions are made at the front line. That used to be the case in England. Over the last decade, England has devolved decision-making right into classrooms, right into schools, creating chains of academies that actually build more frontline capacity. We don't know to what extent that will lead to better outcomes. The causal nature of those relationships is very, very complex to establish. But it's certainly a good cross-country predictor for success. Well, and the rest of the decisions get made at very different levels. You can see the blue bar in the United States is very large. That's basically most of the responsibility here rests with districts, and then comes a little bit at state and federal levels and so on. But in fact, according to our data, what matters most for success is actually the discretion that is actually at the level of schools. And that's where I think something is still missing. Some say, well, if you give more discretion to schools, you end up with larger social inequalities. It's going to be harder to allocate teaching resources more equitably. Actually, interesting is the opposite what our data show. Actually, those school systems that have most flexibility in the systems have been the ones that are best in matching teacher supply with student learning needs. Why? Because actually, if you look at systems like the Netherlands or Hong Kong or United Kingdom, Belgium, those systems that are very much frontline oriented, is because they don't let 1,000 flowers bloom. They actually create also very strong systems around those schools that actually, for parents, it's easy to choose their schools because they have very good information. They're also very, very good in creating links between schools so that teachers can actually move across schools and school networks. They create very strong school standards and quality assurance mechanisms so that they actually know where innovation leads to improvement and where it just leads to doing something differently. So those systems have become very, very good to manage that diversity and matching resources with needs. It's one of the most interesting findings that actually equity in education and devolving responsibility to the front line, at least statistically across countries, are actually two sides of the same coin. And last but not least, it's about parents. We often forget, we think very much supply-sided in education. Actually, one of the best predictors is the views and attitudes of parents. The fact whether parents ask their children, how was school on a regular basis, and you don't need a degree for that, you don't need to spend hours of time, but it's just, showing your child that what they do in school is actually matters to you. That more predictive power on science and math learning than actually family income. But it happens much too rarely. But we can see actually where parents say they're interested in school, students are a lot more likely to be wanting to be good at this. They're much more satisfied with their lives. Getting parents on board is something really important. A while ago, I was in one of the poorest provinces in China. And they were educating, again, the first generation of children. And parents often didn't really want their children to be at school because they would be much more useful at home helping them and so on. And I asked a teacher, you know, how do you actually get parents on board? Because this school was amazing to me. It was in one of the poorest areas, and it was a great school with great teachers, great facilities, technology, everything. And the teacher said, well, you know, I try to call every parent about twice per week. And then I said, oh, well, that must be a big kind of drain on your time, a big workload for you. And the teacher said, yeah, but, you know, I never thought about it like this. You know, if I wouldn't have all of these parents helping me, I could never do my job. So actually, this link between parents and students and teachers was very, very important in this, and something that comes out in our data. It's about moving from standards and conformity to fostering ingenuity. And that's one of the most kind of devastating findings from our teacher survey. When we ask actually teachers to what extent they would be recognized, rewarded, cherished for being more innovative in their work, actually only a quarter of teachers said that innovation is recognized. 3/4 of teachers perceived their school as an innovation hostile environment. That may not be the truth. That's just a perception. But if we cannot change that perception, we're unlikely to change behavior. So there a lot of work needs to be done to make schools more open to innovation. It's also about moving from, you know, layering decisions on top of each other in the education system to achieving better alignment between what we do at school, at local, at regional, at national levels, better alignment between what we do in school and what we do in life. We're often not very good in integrating the world of schooling and the world of work. When you ask yourself, for example, why do American schools teach so much calculus and trigonometry? You don't, when you ask mathematicians, is this really the foundation of mathematics? They will tell you no. You know, these are just some very specific applications of mathematics. The foundations of math, thinking like a mathematician, is not about trigonometry and calculus. When you ask, you know, people in industry and the workforce, you know, do you need those skills? They will tell you, well, no, of course not. You know, that's what computers do for you. The reason why we teach those things is because those kinds of tools were useful 200-300 years ago when people measured the size of the fields and so on. But it's been very, very difficult to reconceptualize mathematics education, thinking about the kind of math that is going to enable young people to be successful in tomorrow's world. Because again, as it's very easy to add something to the education system, really hard to take something away that is no longer important. No? So that brings me to the last question. How do we make change happen in education? On the one hand, I'm deeply optimistic. The amount of change and progress that we have seen in education has been absolutely impressive. Countries like Vietnam, they were not on our map 10 years ago. We never expected that they would become, in the year 2015, one of the world's leading education systems. It has happened. Enormous progress around the world. The idea that every student can achieve good learning outcomes is becoming a reality in many education systems. But it is really, really hard. We know a lot about what makes school systems succeed, but translating that into better policies and practices proves really hard. What we found very, very important is first to be clear about the direction, to think really out strategically, how is tomorrow's world going to look like, and how do we build school systems around what we have. If we would invent schooling from scratch, nobody would come up with the kind of infrastructure that we have. That is really a relic of the industrial age, a very heavy bureaucratic school system. It's about engaging the profession. One thing is very clear, where teachers and the profession isn't deeply involved in the design of change, they're never going to help with implementation. You see that all around the world. It's about building capacity. Actually, it's not so much about money, it's about capacity. And with capacity, I mean leadership at every layer of the education system. Teacher leaders, school leaders, system leaders. People are actually the driving. If you go, for example, to Singapore, you see these wonderful professional learning communities in school where teachers work together to frame and develop good practice. It happens because there are leaders around them to support their careers, to support them to advance. And last but not least, is about looking outward. I must really say that's, for me, always one of the biggest surprises, how inward-looking education is. Teachers rarely look outwards to the neighboring school. School leaders are rarely connected. There's something about systemic policy, and education systems often find lots of excuses why they don't have to work with or learn from other countries. Now, we are different. Everything is different. The context is different. But actually, the closer you look at this, the kind of common features of high-performing systems are actually very, very transversal. Some countries have become very good at this. You know, if you're a school leader in Finland, for example, they ask you to spend 2/3 of your time running your school, and 1/3 of your time you actually work in the school district. So the school district is not an institution of administrators, but actually school leaders who run their schools are actually also the very same people who manage the system, who make strategic decisions, who align their resources and needs across the system, involving people. If you are a teacher in Singapore, most likely you'd spend a year, maybe 2, in government, in the Ministry of Education. You are not just implementing policy. They will draw on your expertise as a teacher to design novel policies. You'll spend 100 hours per year, a lot going back to research. So basically, it's a very flexible, open progression where teachers can advance in their careers. It's intellectually attractive, looking outward across sectors, and of course, across countries. One of the things that really strikes me in looking at this around the world is that universal, high-quality education is something that we can make happen for every child. Yes, social background and many contextual factors are huge barriers that make it difficult, but modern technology allows us to personalize learning in a way that we can actually match resources with needs in a way that every student can get access to excellent teaching and learning, and that we can deliver a future for lots of learners who currently struggle. Thank you very much.
Please welcome Chairman and CEO of America Achieves, John Schnurr.
Hey, Andreas. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Wow. Well, I think anyone who's ever heard Andreas present before knows that there's an incredible wealth of information and data from what's working around the world and what's not. And so it's a great treat to have you with us today, Andreas. We've got decision makers, leaders from across the country. These are people who really can drive and are driving change. So your information is going to be in good hands here. 4 years ago, you came to this group, and we were talking a little bit before, and you said the biggest thing that's changed in 4 years in your analyses is that you had rankings 4 years ago, but you got much more information on the why change is happening, why improvement is happening. And I want to dig into the why in a minute. But I have a couple questions up front about helping us where we are, understand where we are in the US. You mentioned data that showed that 55-year-olds in the US were near first in the world compared to their peers, with 1 in 5 mastering the skills that were assessed. And younger 18 to 24-year-olds had improved. 1 in 3 had those skills, but we fell from top of the world to bottom half of the world. Sounds to me like you're saying that we're kind of moving ahead and falling behind at the same time. Moving ahead relatively, falling behind on an absolute level. Sometimes in this country we have people say, hey, the school system's failed, it used to be great. Others say it's fine. Seems to me you're saying we're neither failing nor fine. Maybe we're not keeping up, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think the world is changing much faster than the schooling system, and that's particularly true for the world here, particularly at the frontier. You know, it's not just about volume of learning, it's the nature of learning. In many countries, school systems spend a lot more time on preparing for this 21st century, educating students deep conceptual understanding in the subject disciplines, thinking like a scientist, thinking like an historian, thinking like a mathematician. And in the United States, the learning is still very kind of shallow, a mile wide, and inch deep in many instructional systems. It's not just volume, it's the nature of learning. So as soon as you probe into advanced thinking skills, and that's what we do in those tests, you see that many young people really struggle.
And you're seeing across the world, even in the last 4 years, systems moving ahead in the ways you've described. There's been a lot of change around the world. You've given us a lot of information. If you could describe a couple of the biggest changes, positive changes you've seen in the world, systems that have really moved the dial on some of the issues you've mentioned, that's leading to outcomes, what would you highlight as a couple of the biggest changes in the last several years?
I think the biggest move is really the kind of shift from these very heavy, industrialized, bureaucratic systems to systems that are much more responsive, much more flexible, much more innovative, that give teachers, schools a lot more discretion, but that also have grown stronger as systems. In a way, there are two trends. One is a lot of devolution of responsibilities to schools, but at the same time also the establishment of many devices that allow systems to see where things are working and where not, and that allow sort of guide parents, give people the kind of knowledge about the functioning of education has really, really improved. So in the past, parents would get the score of their child, but it would be, if you look, for example, to a country like Australia, you can log on the internet, you can see any school around the world, around the country, not just in terms of the learning outcomes, but also what makes the school special, what are its distinguishing features as seen by the schools themselves. So these things did not exist in the past. A lot of more flexibility in the front line, teacher careers. There are many more ways to become a teacher now and many more ways to progress as a teacher. It's not a kind of golden cage where you move once for your lifetime and with attractive careers. I think that's something that I find really encouraging, a deeper professionalization, really.
You mentioned in your presentation that the level of autonomy at the school level is really important, and you said that before, but you've seen that grow over time in some countries with very positive results, where at the school level there are decisions that are made. Can you describe more what that looks like at the school level? What type of decisions are being made at the school level in the countries that you see using that theory well?
Yeah, there's sort of two parts that you need to distinguish. One is autonomy in shaping the instructional environment. Think about assessment practices, curriculum implementation. Countries like Finland, Denmark would give a lot of autonomy on that part. And then there is autonomy in resource use. Britain would give schools, all of their schools, a 3-yearly budget. And you are the school leader, you figure out how you're going to use this over the next 3 years. You can hire more teachers, or you can buy more computers, or you can pay your teachers better and hire fewer. So there's a lot of discretion on resource use. And some countries do both. That's what I showed here for the Netherlands or Czech Republic and so on. So the way in which autonomy is used varies, but it's grown over time. There's more responsibility now in schools and also more capacity. Issues around leadership have become really at the forefront of policy. So school leadership, teacher leadership are topics moving from administrative leadership to real professional leadership and instructional leadership.
You had mentioned, we were talking before about in some of these systems, all the schools are getting authority that sometimes that a charter school might get, but across the system. When that works, you mentioned, but I'd love for people in this room thinking about kind of autonomy at the school level for all schools, what would you prioritize as the most important conditions that need to be in place at the systems level in order to make sure that school level autonomy is having the impact that you think it can?
And I think at the systems level, you need to have a really robust framework of standards. You need to have a shared understanding of what good performance really means. That doesn't say, you should tell schools what they should teach, but you should actually have a good understanding what good performance really looks like. I think it's also important that schools perceive themselves as part of the school system, not as autonomous entities. And in fact, when you go to the Netherlands, all of the schools are run by private entities, but they still perceive themselves to be part of the public system because there is a public system of shared standards. I think what's also important is having some good devices to see the functioning of schools. There can be inspection, like in England, where actually teams of people would visit schools of peers. Netherlands, Flanders as well. So I think you need to have the eyes and ears to see where and how schools succeed. And last but not least, I think it's very important to have good systems of knowledge mobilization. How do actually schools learn from and with each other? And I think that's something where Asia is very good. In Japan, most teachers would change their school every 3 years, so they transport that knowledge. In China, it's all about digital knowledge sharing. There are a lot of incentives for teachers to contribute to the common good. Vietnam is very good in pairing high and low performing schools, sort of making sure if you're a high performing school, they'll give you more money, but you can't, and you can hire more people, more expertise, but you cannot use those resources in your own place. You can use those resources to help a lower performing school, which makes you more prestigious, gives you more capacity, but the lower performing school gets that kind of expertise. There are many, I think those devices of knowledge sharing, knowledge mobilization I would also think are important conditions.
It's interesting, because sometimes there's a debate about centralization versus decentralization, and I'm hearing you say autonomy at the school level for the teacher, school leader on decision-making, in many ways instruction and resources, people, budget, but a few system issues, shared standards, professionalization, organization of knowledge, interventions where things aren't working. So it's kind of a combination of autonomy and some targeted systems changes. And what's if you pick one country that's gotten that balance right, what country do you think would be a useful country to look at?
Well, I judge this by the PISA results. The countries that actually do really well, I think, you go to Hong Kong, Netherlands, I think they are Ontario, British Columbia, here in North America, I think those are pretty good in all of this. No? The most impressive statistic about a country like Finland in Europe is not its high average performance, but it's that only 5% of performance variation lies between schools, despite the fact that every school is fully autonomous. But it's because every school knows what every other school is doing, and there's this very there's competition on the, not by asking parents to make good choices, but competition on the supply side, so that teachers and schools really work together to advance, and they actually achieve a very coherent set of outcomes. In very different modes. The kind of environments can be very, very different in schools. Also in the Netherlands, you have many religious schools, you have many kind of pedagogical kind of models in the school systems, but they're all good choices for parents. I think that's the really important part. In prior presentations and data you shared, you've talked about the US ranking in the world. I don't want to spend much time on the ranking, but one thing you've said that I wanted to ask you about is you've said that some people think that maybe the US is ranked where it is primarily because of where our low-income students are. I think you've said that's not the case, that poverty is not destiny, and also that even if we looked at just middle-class Americans, that wouldn't actually put us higher in the rankings. Is that right? And how do you think about the relationship between income and the US place in the world rankings? Yeah, no, I hear that a lot. People tell me the United States is more diverse. It's actually not true. There are many countries equally socially diverse. There are many countries equally ethnically diverse. There are many countries actually with more child poverty, doing a lot better with poorer children, as I showed on this chart. So I don't think that you can find the reasons in the context. It's really the capacity of systems to mobilize the talent of children and disadvantaged that distinguishes countries. Same as immigration. Many people say you've got more students with an immigrant background, that's going to drag your performance down. No evidence to support this. Actually, the country where you go to school makes much more of a difference than the country where you come from. You can see an effect of the country of origin, absolutely. But the country of destination has a much bigger effect on learning outcomes across countries. So I do think many of the excuses that we actually like to use are not valid when you look at this.
So we both have real gaps between low-income students and more affluent students, although low-income students in some countries are doing much better. But we also have an issue in terms of where our middle class is compared to the standard needed across the world. We've only got 3 minutes left, and we've got a number of questions to ask you. The shift in what's expected of students, you mentioned a lot, but if you to boil it down to what you think the most important shifts in terms of what education systems that are successful are expecting of students in schools, what are the most important shifts that you've seen?
Yeah, it's a move away from accumulation of content knowledge, which is easily now searchable, to giving students a better understanding of the foundations of disciplines. If you can think like a mathematician, you can make really great use of Google. If you can't think of like a mathematician, accumulating lots of formulas and equations is not going to help you. In the past, you could learn once for a lifetime. Today, it's really about having those kinds of tools that help you, learn for yourself, advance your content. Complex problem solving has become really important. Creativity, critical thinking, but often creativity and critical thinking come out of the disciplines. It's not another subject. It's about being creative in mathematics, being creative in many of the disciplines. Social skill dimension is probably the one that is most neglected. Mm-hmm. Resilience, courage, leadership, social skills. They are the ones, we talk about them, but then we put students behind individual desks, and at the end of the year, we give them a test where they have to prove they are better than their neighbor. So it's not actually developing the kind of social skills, teamwork skills that are really important.
I've heard people say with this shift in the world, the information available, that knowledge is a commodity, knowledge isn't as important. It's more about skills, thinking skills only. But it sounds like you're saying that actually the deeper understanding of knowledge is important. This isn't to move away from knowledge, it's an ability to understand, have deeper knowledge that can be applied. Is that right?
Absolutely. You know, I don't think, you know, thinking skills do not help you if you do not understand the foundations of the disciplines. We need to remain true to the disciplines, but at the same time encourage interdisciplinary understanding. And that's really teaching fewer things at greater depths. That's, I think, the most important principle, really. And that's something that some countries, in the end of the 19th, Japan took out 30% of school content out of school curricula. It was hugely controversial because the first thing parents do is, you know, my child no longer learns all these important things. But actually, 15 years later, is the country with the steepest gains on creative skills. It has given teachers the space to actually get students much more deeply involved in the content.
Teaching fewer things more deeply. Quick couple questions. Testing, how's testing, do we test more or less similar in the US compared to testing across the world?
Yeah, the United States pretty much on average. There are countries that would test a lot more, countries that would test a lot more in the classroom. In the United States, much of the testing comes from the outside. That's perhaps sort of special, but the prevalence of testing to students, you would see a lot more in countries. I mean, students in the United States don't get many signals of how well they're actually doing. Often they get good marks when their results are not so great. Actually, in many countries, there would be a much closer mirror. You know, learning and assessment would be more of the same rather than assessment taking time away from learning and coming externally. So as a student, the diagnosis of teachers, I think, would have a bigger role.
If we had more time, I was going to ask you about CTE. I know there's a lot in your reports about what's been learned about CTE and career programs around the world, but I think we're out of time, so I wanted to give you a huge applause. Thank you so much, Andreas, for joining us. Hope you'll come back.
Thanks, John. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our session. Strategy sessions.